Those 50 years right after the Civil War, America didn't just rebuild, it was completely reborn. It was this wild era of explosive growth and, honestly, pretty brutal conflict. And it was all driven by a new force that kind of crept out of the shadows, the money power. So we're going to dive into how this new power totally reshaped the nation and ask a question that's just as important today as it was way back then.
And yeah, that's really the heart of it all, isn't it? What actually happens when just a handful of people, through their companies, become more powerful than the country itself? This was the central fight, the main event that defined an entire generation of Americans.
Okay, so let's set the stage. The year is 1865. The Civil War is over, the nation is technically one country again, but in reality, it's deeply, deeply divided. And while a lot of folks were looking west with this incredible optimism, the seeds of a whole new kind of conflict were already being planted. The feeling, at least in the North and for anyone heading west, was just electric. The slaves were finally free, the frontier was wide open. It really felt like America was on the verge of this golden age of opportunity for absolutely everyone. The promise was so simple and so powerful: cheap land and high wages, forever.
But that dream, it wasn't the reality for everyone. Down in the South, the old economic system was still pretty much in place, with power stuck in the hands of just a few. And at the same time, up north, the factories that have been cranking out supplies for the Union Army, they were now pumping out goods at this incredible rate, creating a totally new and completely unregulated kind of power.
So this new corporate power didn't just pop up out of nowhere. Nope. It was the result of a few really powerful ideas and one gigantic project that literally tied the nation together and created the perfect storm for businesses to get bigger than anyone had ever imagined.
It all kicks off with the Transcontinental Railroad. I mean, building this thing was a monumental task, so the government had to step in and encourage private companies with huge land grants and massive loans. This created what economists call a natural monopoly. Think about it. Once you spend a fortune building one railroad line, it's insanely expensive for someone else to build another one right next to it. So that first company has total control. They get to set the prices for a whole region, and farmers had no choice but to pay whatever they demanded.
And this brings us to the secret sauce of the entire era: economies of scale. It's actually a pretty simple idea. Your local blacksmith, he can hammer out a few tools a day. But a massive steel mill, it can churn out thousands of them, and each one costs pennies on the dollar to make. This created a huge barrier. Once a company got big, it was almost impossible for the little guy to compete.
And nobody, and I mean nobody, played this new game better than John D. Rockefeller. His company, Standard Oil, didn't just get big. It used its size as a weapon. He'd buy the companies that supplied his materials and the stores that sold his oil. He would lean on the railroads to give him secret discounts on shipping, which let him sell his oil cheaper than anyone else. He'd just keep undercutting his competition until they had two choices: sell their company to him or go bankrupt.
And then you have the ultimate organizer, the banker, J.P. Morgan. He looked at Rockefeller's strategy and thought, we can take this even further. Instead of just one company dominating an industry, he would merge several giant companies into one massive super company called a trust. This is where a single board of trustees would manage a bunch of different companies, essentially creating a monopoly. It's how giants like U.S. Steel were born, and they ended up controlling entire sectors of the economy.
Now, you can't deny it. This new system was incredibly efficient. It built the modern America we know today in record time. But, and it's a huge but, this progress came at a staggering social cost. It created this massive canyon between the super rich and the working poor. To really wrap your head around the scale of this new wealth, just let this sink in. John D. Rockefeller became the world's first billionaire. $1 billion. At the very same time, the entire state government of an industrial powerhouse like Massachusetts was running on just $7 million in tax revenue. The private fortune of one man was bigger than the public funds of an entire state. It's just mind-boggling.
This crazy contrast is perfectly captured by the name Mark Twain gave this period, the Gilded Age. You know, something that's gilded has a thin, shiny layer of gold on the outside, but underneath, it's made of much cheaper stuff. On the surface, you had the glittering fortunes and lavish lifestyles of the so-called robber barons. That was the nickname for these industrialists. But just beneath all that glitter was the harsh, grinding reality for the millions of farmers and workers whose labor made it all possible.
So, what was the mindset of these new corporate titans? How did they see their role in society? Well, this quote pretty much says it all. An executive at one of J.P. Morgan's railroads was asked about his company's responsibility to the people, and he just said, "I owe the public nothing." This was a brand new kind of power, one that felt like it answered to nobody but its own profits.
And this new system put a brutal squeeze on everyday Americans. Out on the farms, new technology meant they were growing more food than ever before. But ironically, that made prices crash. At the same time, they had to buy their supplies and pay for shipping from monopolies that could charge whatever they wanted. And in the cities, factory workers were dealing with 12-hour days, 7 days a week in dangerous conditions. And if they tried to organize a union to ask for more, the bosses would often just hire private armies to break up the strikes by force.
Eventually, you can only push people so far. Things reached a breaking point. People all over the country started to realize this wasn't just about economics. It was a real crisis for American democracy. And so, the public started to demand that their government finally do something about it.
So the government tries to step in, but their first few attempts, they were completely toothless. They created the Interstate Commerce Commission to regulate railroads, but it had no real power to enforce its rules. Then they passed the Sherman Antitrust Act to break up monopolies. But in this crazy twist, the courts mostly used it against labor unions, while the actual trusts just kept getting bigger and more powerful.
The whole game changed with the arrival of Theodore Roosevelt. Now, unlike the presidents before him, who pretty much sided with big business, Roosevelt, who came from a wealthy family himself, saw the unchecked power of these corporations as a major threat to the country. He famously called them the malefactors of great wealth, the wrongdoers of great wealth, and he made it his mission to get them under control.
And this quote right here, this was his core belief. This was the driving idea of the whole progressive movement. Roosevelt's argument was simple. If private power, the power of corporations, has gotten this huge, then public power, the power of the government, which represents the people, has to get even bigger to act as a check, as a counterbalance.
I mean, you have to understand, this philosophy was a radical shift in the role of the American government. That old idea of laissez-faire, the French term that means let it be, where the government just stays out of the economy, that idea was officially dead. In its place, you had a whole new era of active government regulation and oversight.
So what did this new philosophy actually do? Well, it led to this wave of reforms that basically built the modern American state. First, they passed the federal income tax, which gave the government a steady stream of money to fund all its new responsibilities. Second, they created the Federal Reserve, a central bank that could manage the nation's money supply and stop the financial panics that kept happening. This took a ton of power out of the hands of private bankers like J.P. Morgan. And finally, they passed new, stronger antitrust laws that gave the government the actual tools it needed to break up monopolies.
And it's really important to remember, America's industrial boom didn't happen in a bubble. The same stuff was happening all over the world, and it led to this intense international competition. Just look at this chart. By 1913, a newly unified Germany had rocketed past Great Britain, the longtime industrial champ, in steel production. This economic rivalry wasn't just business. It was fueling a massive arms race and creating the tensions that would eventually explode into World War I.
Which leaves us with this final and pretty humbling thought from the economist John Maynard Keynes. The Gilded Age created this incredibly powerful, complex, and delicate economic machine. And the central challenge they faced back then, and let's be honest, the challenge we still face today, is figuring out how to control it without completely breaking it. That debate, the one over the right balance between public power and private power that was born in this era, well, it's still defining our world.